You ever wonder how many video games are out there that'll never see the light of day? Like, making a game, any game, is insanely hard. Even the worst ones, and trust me, we'll get to some of those. Cancelled video games are almost always a tragedy. But you know what may be even worse? Cancelled Dragon Ball video games. Games that were announced, demoed, sometimes even played, and then hackai'd. I mean, there was even a Dreamcast game announced by The Guardian to be in production, and then never talked about again. Take Dragon Ball Time and Space Legend, for example. This was an MMORPG developed specifically for China. It took elements from Dragon Ball Xenoverse to create a new experience. If you know your Dragon Ball video game history, you know the previous MMORPG was Dragon Ball Online, which in itself inspired Xenoverse. We'll talk about it later on, but this was kind of a full circle moment. It looked really nice, with a pretty great art direction. It was first unveiled during China Joy 2019 as a new Bandai Namco game, developed by Giant Network, a development studio based in Shanghai. 2 closed betas were held in January and May of 2019, exclusively to players in China and Taiwan. 4 playable races were available: Saiyans, Earthlings, Majins, and Namekians, with some customization options but unique designs. It really did just seem like another installment in the Xenoverse franchise. Its hub area was more or less Canton City, and Xeno Trunks even served as a guide, calling upon the player with Shenron just like in Xenoverse 1. The story followed the Time Patrol, and players travel through eras in the Dragon Ball timeline to fix disruptions, this time focusing on Goku's early adventures from the original Dragon Ball. Though you could also play as other characters along the way. It had the hallmarks of many MMOs: quests, dungeons, boss battles, co-op, PvE challenges, 1v1 duels, 3v3 and 5v5 battles, even a world tournament mode, so it was pretty far along, with a bunch of different areas we never see in games. Sadly, it just kind of seemed like a mess. Yes, this was a beta, but imagine Xenoverse, but the game just kind of played itself, and not nearly as flashy, with features breaking like the ability to use hero cards to unlock characters, and the combat was monotonous and boring.
This game does everything for you and you're always running, but all the objectives are broken too. The sound and music breaks. This is the open beta, and this is worse than like the first week it was open.
After the closed beta test, the official game's website stopped updating, and it seemed like it went quiet for a while. It wasn't until May 21st, 2020 that the public beta was finally unveiled, for around 6 months. And then everything was scrapped, microtransactions were refunded, and it was just cancelled completely. The download was disabled on December of that year, and on January 2021, the servers were completely shut down. So it looks like the beta didn't go too well. Sometime before this game was unveiled, Tencent and Giant Network released a separate mobile MMORPG called Dragon Ball Strongest Warrior, with a similar art style. Some fans believe that Time and Space Legend was meant to be the PC sibling to Strongest Warrior, since they were both developed by Giant Network. And although Strongest Warrior did last for a few years, it was eventually shut down on November 22nd, 2022. But there's plenty of Dragon Ball games that we over here will never get to play, at least officially, since they were specifically made for the Chinese market. So, although not the focus of this video, I think it's worth mentioning that a new Chinese Dragon Ball game was recently unveiled: Dragon Ball Z Battle Peak, developed by Babble-Time Technology and Joy Games. This shares some of the same bright anime visuals as The Strongest Warrior and Time Space Legend, but it's completely unrelated, a brand new project from a different studio. Babble-Time has handled other anime properties for mobile titles in China, so it makes sense. And it kinda just seems to be like Kakarot but on phones, and with much simpler combat. So we'll see if this one lasts longer than the others. It's a shame that Time and Space Legend never went anywhere, since it actually represented a lot of original Dragon Ball which we usually never get in games, like Goku and the others at Pilaf's castle, or the battle against King Piccolo, with some pretty nice cutscenes. But if you thought that was the only Dragon Ball game to get cancelled, then you're in for a surprise. There is a long history of Dragon Ball games that never saw the light of day. So let's go back in time all the way to 1986. In 1986, Sega released Alex Kidd in Miracle World for the Master System. It's always been rumored that he was created as a competitor to Mario, before Sonic. However, the reality is actually more interesting in my opinion. Originally, Alex Kidd was supposed to be a Dragon Ball game. This is actually fairly obvious when you start to look into it. There are plenty of early Dragon Ball staples, like pterodactyls, bear bandits, bike sequences, and the rock paper scissors. Alex himself is already based on Son Wukong from Journey to the West. In the book, Untold History of Japanese Game Developers, Kotaro Hayashida, the creator of Alex Kidd, explained, well, I might get it a bit wrong after all this time, but at first, Sega was planning on making a Dragon Ball game. I guess this happened long enough ago that it's okay for me to talk about this. The project began as a Dragon Ball title, not as a direct competitor to Super Mario Bros. But when we were told that we could not use the Dragon Ball license anymore, we were forced to come up with our own ideas instead. For example, when it was Dragon Ball, Goku fought with his power pole, but we changed that to a punch attack. It was only after we came up with a plan to restart the project as Alex Kidd in Miracle World, we started thinking about Mario and looking for ways in which to differentiate the title from it. So, although not a cancelled game necessarily, it was a Dragon Ball game completely lost due to rights issues. It's also worth noting that in the US, Shenron no Naso, the first Dragon Ball game for the Famicom, was brought over with a completely new coat of paint, as Dragon Power. But that's not so much a lost Dragon Ball game as much as localization shenanigans. So we move on from a game that got stripped away from Dragon Ball to what is perhaps the most well-known and most mysterious Dragon Ball game. In 1994, Bandai showcased one of the strangest Dragon Ball games ever made, and almost nobody got to play it. Panasonic hosted 3DO World twice, on March 29th in Osaka and April 1st in Tokyo, hyped up in Shonen Jump as the only place you could try this brand new Dragon Ball Z game, all to advertise the soon-to-fail console, the 3DO. This was a console that had high expectations, with quite a lot of companies supporting it, including Bandai, with an Ultraman game. So in order to further promote it, Panasonic teamed up with Bandai and Dragon Ball to showcase something special. At the event, the game was called
Dragon Ball Z 3DO でセルと対決だ,
which translates to Dragon Ball Z, the confrontation against Cell on the 3DO. But this wasn't a normal game, it was a punching game. You wore a glove and hit a pad, and the strength of your punch would determine what happened to Cell on the screen. Finally, a way to experience how Toriyama felt while drawing those fight scenes. We only have two actual images of the game, one of Cell before the punch and one of Goku after punching Cell, though we do have some animation cells of Cell himself. The event flyer itself mentions this game was built specifically for the presentation, though the few magazines that reported on the event teased at a future release, both with a punch peripheral and a simpler control scheme, so perhaps it really was meant to be something bigger one day. But the 3DO was doomed to fail. For years, people repeated that this was just the port of the arcade game VR Versus, a game that originally had motion controls, but was later ported to regular arcade machines, and is most widely known thanks to its game original character designed by Toriyama, Majin Ozoto, one of the main villains in Dragon Ball Heroes. But the 3DO setup was built around strength-reading punches, not the motion controls nor gameplay of VR Versus. Through all of my research, I've concluded that the VR Versus theory is almost 99% not true, especially seeing how very recently the Dragon Ball Daimania channel published a video in which Peking Duck, who is perhaps the Dragon Ball collector, explained how the game actually worked since he was there. And he does describe a strength-based game with 3 possible endings for how Cell would react.
モニターに、バストアップのセルがこう、
いる。
で画面とは何ポイントとかそういうの全くないですよ。画面にセルの顔だけ。
It's a whole thing, and I have a lot more to talk about for this game alone. So much so that I plan to make a standalone video on it, since I obsessed with researching this for like a week. If you want a more complete breakdown with photos, pamphlets, scratch card system, all that, then be on the lookout for a video later on. But for the sake of this video, just know there was once a 3DO presentation where you'd punch Cell in the face and it disappeared. It's wild to think that the first of these lost Dragon Ball games is one you had to actually punch to play, and that's just the beginning. Another cancelled Dragon Ball game wasn't really a new game at all, but rather a different version of one. The English release of Dragon Ball Z Super Butoden 2 for the Super Nintendo. In March 1996, Club Nintendo magazine, the official Nintendo magazine in Latin America, which I grew up with, ran a full 4-page story on this mysterious English adaptation, even featuring Dragon Ball on the cover. They introduced the characters to readers who, at the time, barely really knew who Goku even was, broke down the game's modes, and offered gameplay tips. This was a long time before the Spanish dub reached the cell arc, so the article was kind of spoiling everything.
Solo son unos insectos.
¡Ay, no solo me robó las células, también mis diálogos!
The localization itself had some creative liberties. Broly was Tara, Zangia turned into Megrim, and Bojack became Pumparu. Although Zangia and Bojack's names seem to be completely original, Broly's name of Tara actually comes from the French release of the game, one of the only languages this game was translated to. So it seems like this English translation would have been based on that one. Yeah, the plan was to sell an English version of a Japanese game translated from French into Spanish-speaking countries. What could go wrong? This is actually not super uncommon, but if they were gonna change the names anyways, why not just keep all the French ones? It seems like Bandai wasn't targeting Mexico alone. This seems to have been a test run for a North American release, meaning we could have gotten a Dragon Ball console game many years before Final Bout. This version was simply titled Dragon Ball, dropping the Z completely and removing the subtitle of Super Butoden 2. So what happened? Well, Dragon Ball just wasn't big yet. We know Dragon Ball now was being loved in Latin America, but that was still a little bit away. Early attempts at dubbing the series were infamous. Some of you may be familiar with the Harmony Gold dub, an English dub that renamed Goku into Zero.
I'm Lena, by the way. What's your name? I'm Zero. Zero? That fits.
Well, Latin America also had that.
Soy Bulma, ¿no es cierto? ¿Cómo te llamas? Yo soy Cero. ¿Cero? ¿Te queda bien?
And it pretty much doomed the show until the better dub came along. The now iconic Latin American dub didn't air until 1995, and it wouldn't be until 1998 that the Cell Saga would be dubbed. In the US, Dragon Ball Z wouldn't really explode until Cartoon Network's Toonami picked it up in 1998. At the time of this project, Dragon Ball was still fairly niche in the Americas, so the translation was quietly scrapped. Ironically, Super Butoden 2 would make it to the West eventually, but only as a pre-order bonus for Extreme Butoden on the 3DS, and with no English translation. Sometimes games don't just die in development, sometimes they die in translation. I guess you could say it was lost in translation. Now this one's a real mystery. In 1997, at the Tokyo Toy Show, Bandai showed off something that left fans puzzled for years: a bizarre motion-captured exhibit featuring a fully 3D polygonal Goku. The Tokyo Toy Show is Japan's biggest toy fair, the same event where Tamagotchis, Gundams, and even the first Pokemon games were revealed. That year, Bandai set up a massive screen with a network of sensors connected to a presenter who mimicked Dragon Ball attacks like the Kamehameha, the Genki Dama, or Piccolo's Makan Kozapo, which might be the only time we've ever seen Goku use it. As the presenter moved, Goku copied his motions in real time through motion capture. It was basically Dragon Ball Z for Kinect, but 15 years before it existed, which means it probably worked better than the Kinect ever did. For years, this photo published on PC Watch on March 21st, 1997 was the only thing we had for it, showing a man performing the Kamehameha while dressed up as Goku. The article mentioned that Sega Saturn and PlayStation software were on display, and that this was a motion capture demonstration using Dragon Ball characters, with quite a few places online claiming that this demonstration was for a supposed Sega Saturn game, but nothing ever came of it. Eventually though, a bunch of footage from the presentation was uncovered in an old video about the toy show. In the footage, we see the attacks being played out, while explaining how the system used the wired motion capture setup to create more realistic animations. She described how Bandai is checking each movement to recreate anime quality action, showing off smooth camera work and lifelike motion. For the time, it's pretty impressive. A lot of fans thought that this was a cancelled game, or perhaps a scrapped control scheme for a certain Dragon Ball video game. But near the end, she says something crucial.
とても楽しみですけれど、このドラゴンボール GT 発売は8月を予定しています。
Well, what is she talking about here? Dragon Ball GT Final Bout launched just a few months later, on August 21st, 1997. It's not exactly clear if she's talking about Final Bout as if it's a different game also available there, or as part of the same showing. It looks as if, although it's always been rumored to be a cancelled game, this wasn't a lost Saturn project, but a live motion-captured tech demo built to promote Final Bout. I especially think this because of how in 1996, a V-Jump presentation talked about Final Bout's motion capture technology as a big deal.
キャラクターたちの動きはモーションキャプチャーと 3D フルポリゴンで作られている。これにより人間により近いリアルな動きを実現した上、悟空やトランクス、その他のキャラクターたちの格闘をあらゆる角度から見ることができるんだ。
So I think that although it could potentially be a lost game or controlled scheme, more than likely it's just showcasing the technology used to bring Goku into his first 3D game. It's one of those mysteries that feel more like performance art than actual game proof, but Bandai seemed really proud of it. I hesitated to include this one, but I might as well mention it. There's a video out there from years ago by Metal Jesus Rock showing off a Nintendo 64 disk drive prototype. The N64DD was a short-lived add-on for the N64, released only in Japan in 1999. It was meant to make bigger, expandable games, but it completely flopped. However, in this video, Metal Jesus Rocks mentions a few games that were intended for the DD, one of them being Dragon Ball Z Block Butoden, which was apparently mentioned in an issue of Nintendo Power. This game also appeared in a video about cancelled N64 games by Digino Gaming, where they suggest that the game may have been developed by Sega Corporation, though I haven't been able to find anything else, not even the magazine issue this could be mentioned in. I don't think they're lying, but if it did exist, then it was likely meant to be a puzzle game that implemented fighting elements, given the Butoden games are a 2D fighter series. In the end, no Dragon Ball game at all was ever released for the Nintendo 64. GamePro Magazine 162 from 2002 had a cover story on many Dragon Ball Z games at the time, including an interview with Infogram's senior vice president, Paul Rind. He talks about multiple planned games for various consoles, some of which are quite weird, and none of them saw the light of day. One of them being a first-person action game for the PC, scheduled for release at the end of the year. A potential Xbox game was mentioned too, with no details, outside of a hopeful release of 2003, but with the caveat that the Xbox player base didn't really fit Dragon Ball, and that the game would only come to fruition if the player base was expanded. I guess he didn't think Dragon Ball fans drank Mountain Dew? Or played Halo? He also described a bold plan for the Legacy of Goku series, one that would literally connect the Game Boy Advance trilogy to a brand new GameCube title. He explained that the GameCube game will be a much bigger, enriched product than any of the GBA series, and it will also enhance the gameplay of the GBA games. The GameCube project was envisioned as an action-adventure RPG with fighting elements, similar to the Legacy of Goku series, but on a larger scale with over 30 playable Dragon Ball characters. The idea was for the storylines to link across platforms, with players transferring valuable power-ups, characters, and other cool stuff between the handheld and the console versions. At that stage, however, no developer had been chosen, and the concept was still in its early stages. This article includes some 3D models and stages said to not be for any specific console. However, a former Webfoot technology developer, Gary Swanson, left a YouTube comment under Golden PSP's video on cancelled PS2 games. Fantastic channel, by the way. He's done some really good videos on this and other anime games. According to Swanson, these models were actually created for a very ill-defined adventure game. There was no formal design document for it, just models, test levels, and early gameplay ideas. This prototype was actually shown off as something of a tech demo at a 2001 E3 presentation, featuring locations like Kame House and Goku traveling through them. This wasn't tied to any specific game, and it was just to showcase their ability to make a console game with these models. It is likely that Rind is talking about this demo in the GamePro interview, but perhaps being a little too enthusiastic about what it actually was. Swanson, in the same comment, mentioned that, as far as he knew, nothing Paul Rind described in the interview relates to any project that was ever in development, and may have straight up just been making up stuff. Though there is one one more game mentioned in the interview, described as a separate, more ambitious game from the planned GameCube title. The level of complexity will be much different than in the GameCube game. The universe will be much bigger. It won't be part of a trilogy, and it will have its own storyline. It will be an action-adventure game with a significant number of fighting elements. It was set to include over 30 playable characters, but it would not be limited to single player. Rind mentioned plans for a multiplayer arena-style mode, potentially supporting 6 to 8 players online or locally, once Sony's network services were ready. Like I said, it's likely that none of these were ever a real game. Maybe Rind was just talking about possible ideas internally discussed, and trying to drum up some hype for the future. But this last mention of an arena fighting mode with multiple players does sound similar to something we nearly got. You see, the Webfoot prototype never materialized into a real game. Instead, those assets were used for something else. Saiyan Smash. No, this wasn't a Dragon Ball Smash Bros. Clone. That's Battle Stadium DON. In late 2003, a mysterious title called Dragon Ball Z Saiyan Smash briefly appeared on the official Nintendo of America website, listed as an upcoming GameCube release with a Q3 2004 window. Within days, the listing vanished, but not before sites like N Europe caught it, even quoted an Atari representative saying, "I cannot confirm it yet, but I will also not deny it." Some thought this was a new 3D fighter in the Budokai line. Others imagined a multiplayer brawler exclusive for the GameCube. And to make things weirder, a few months earlier, Atari's producer for Dragon Ball Z Taiketsu had told GameSpot that the GBA game has the ability to connect to a future GameCube release in order to fully unlock its secrets. That future GameCube release was never named, but the timing did line up with Saiyan Smash. For years, no one knew what it was, until that comment I mentioned previously. Swanson confirmed it. Saiyan Smash was indeed real, a 3D multiplayer action prototype being developed internally at Webfoot, the same studio behind the Legacy of Goku series and Taiketsu. The prototype featured 4-player combat, similar to Power Stone, and was being designed for the PS2, GameCube, and Xbox. Swanson explained that the project hit a wall when Sony refused to allow 4-player support on the PS2, due to low sales of the multi-tap peripheral, and since they were planning on releasing the same game for all consoles, Atari just decided to scrap the project altogether. It's possible that this was the game that was going to have connectivity with Taiketsu, though Swanson claims that the connectivity was something Atari pushed for more so than anything seriously worked on, and it was later completely removed from the game, as according to Webfoot president Dana Dominiak, a link to the GameCube was initially planned, but due to very different release dates between the Game Boy Advance and any future GameCube title, in the end it was not feasible. After the cancellation, Webfoot wrote up a pitch inspired by Devil May Cry and classic arcade beat-em-ups. Atari did like the proposal, but instead of letting Webfoot continue, they handed the concept off to Avalanche Software, and the game was changed into Dragon Ball Z Sagas. Overall, the story of Saiyan Smash and the other cancelled Webfoot titles seemed to be pretty crazy. Swanson went on to describe just how difficult it was to develop Taiketsu as is, since it was originally being worked on by a team in another state, while they worked on Legacy of Goku. By the time he started to work on it, it was too late to change directions, and to make matters even worse, their office had an electrical fire that burned down the entire place, having to work from home. From then on, they just called Taiketsu that which shall not be named. And if you played it, you probably call it that too.
Dragon Ball Z Taiketsu for Nintendo Game Boy Advance. If you've got a favorite character, you've got to fight. Great team.
In 2004, 2 Dragon Ball games were listed in Atari's website. One was Legacy of Goku 4, which we'll get to, and the other was the Red Ribbon Army. The sites were taken down or changed soon after they were discovered, though the description of the OG Dragon Ball 1 read, "On his continuing quest to regain the Dragon Ball which represents the spiritual essence of his beloved grandfather, Goku is horrified to learn that death and destruction seem to be following just behind him. He soon learns that the source of this chaos is the Red Ribbon Army, who are also in hot pursuit of the 7 Dragon Balls, which, when assembled, will grant their owner a wish. Goku's toughest challenges lie ahead as he faces the Red Ribbon's evil generals, hired assassins, and ultimately, the army's Muscle Tower. Along the way, he will meet interesting characters who will become great allies or terrible foes." So, just a normal Tuesday in the Dragon world. But the game just vanished after this. That November, Dragon Ball Advanced Adventure, a fantastic platformer beat-em-up for the GBA, was released in Japan. It's possible that the Red Ribbon Army was a working title for the game's release in the West, though there's no way of really knowing. but it would have been a weird title, seeing how Advanced Adventure covers much more than the Red Ribbon Saga, as it starts at the beginning of Dragon Ball all the way to the defeat of King Piccolo. Maybe this really was a different cancelled game, but the second page that showed up on Atari's website, Legacy of Goku 4, gives us much more to talk about. The Legacy of Goku series was a staple of the Game Boy Advance era, retelling the story of Dragon Ball Z through fun, accessible, and easy-to-play RPGs. Well, the last two at least. The first one was kinda mid. The third game was renamed as Boo's Fury, rather than Legacy 3, to move the series away from the bad reception of the first game. Still, the story continued, but we never got Legacy of Goku 4, though this was a game that was confirmed. I mentioned the webpage that appeared on Atari's website. This game was never released and never materialized in any way beyond this, but it's pretty easy to figure out what happened. Just like with Boo's Fury before it, the game was given a new name, but there was a very good reason, because it wouldn't share almost anything to do with the rest of the series. The game became Dragon Ball GT Transformation.
What began as a quest has become a transformation of power, evil, and adventure.
A side-scroller beat-em-up covering the events of GT up to the final battle against Baby. How do we know this? Well, this same link would be simply transitioned into the GT Transformation page. My theory is that the developers had full intentions of making a new Legacy of Goku game, just like before, but once they realized that it wasn't just one planet, but many other ones, and with the game having been announced only a few months after Boo's Fury, they changed course to the more simple structure of a beat-em-up. But like I said, I do think the developers originally wanted to make a real GT Legacy of Goku. And this brings me to our next entry, to which I'll point you to this GT Transformation ad. At the bottom, you'll see it mentioned that the GT Transformation series will not just be one game, but a duology. The second game was planned well before the first was even released. GameSpot even confirmed the development of a sequel, meaning that GT Transformation 2 was originally going to be... That's right, we move on straight from Legacy of Goku 4 to 5, planned as a follow-up to what eventually became GT Transformation. Legacy of Goku 5 would have told the rest of the GT storyline, Super 17 to the Shadow Dragons. The Video Game History Foundation has released the internal files regarding this cancelled game. Most importantly, the pitch and summary for it. It focuses on the fact that it is a Legacy of Goku game, highlighting features such as overworld flying, pointing out that they'll be able to reuse the map from Boo's Fury or Legacy 2. The game would have featured Goku, Pan, Vegeta, Gogeta, Trunks, Goten, Gohan, and Oob, and would have had multiplayer components, like item trading and co-op multiplayer, on unique puzzle areas outside of the main game. The game was to be made as a direct sequel to what eventually became Transformation, with the destruction of planet Earth and its rebirth, followed by a tutorial taking place in the World Tournament episode at the start of the Super 17 arc. The document goes on to talk about the plot, where Goku must escape Hell and defeat Super 17 with his mighty Dragon Punch attack, though they call Hell Heffel like in the old dub days. We then move on to the Shadow Dragons arc, where Goku and Pan go after each Dragon Ball while defeating the dragons, claiming each battle to be unique and exciting, and that players will have to help Bulma find parts for the Blood Waves machine to allow Vegeta to turn into a Super Saiyan 4. Something very interesting here is that the description gives an outright explanation about Goku's fate at the end of the story, something that's kind of been left to our own interpretations, saying that Goku gives up his life in exchange for one last wish to Shenron, asking to return things to the way it was prior to the Shadow Dragons. Though it seems like once they changed the original view for Legacy of Goku 4, the sequel changed course too. A later summary of concept changed the name to GT Transformation 2 and shifted to a beat-em-up as a more direct sequel to the original GT game, with more focus on 1 to 4 players. The game would also include a fantasy mode, where you could play as a team of 3 characters, which now included Goku, Pan, Trunks, Goten, Oob, Vegeta, Chi-Chi, wearing pots and pants like in the Super 17 arc, and Nova Shenron. Nova in particular had a passive ability, where enemies would be damaged on contact because of his body heat. The game would have also had the ability to transfer hero stats from the original game, and unlock special bonuses. The reception of the first GT Transformation was fairly negative, so it doomed the plans for a sequel. But that's not the end of the Legacy of Goku story. On April 19th, 2016, the Webfoot Technology Facebook page posted a screenshot of GT Transformation with a comment that asked fans to spread the word and bring support. Slowly, more Dragon Ball images were posted, one of Goku, Vegeta, Piccolo, and Krillin in a parody of Abbey Road, another of Dabura and Gohan, But the most interesting one was a screenshot of a 4-player battle mode similar to Smash Bros, saying that this was from an old GBA prototype, though they would like to include a battle mode in Legacy of Goku 4. They finally pulled the trigger and asked if this was the correct direction. A 2D pixel art game, Legacy of Goku 4, available on PC, Mac, Android, iOS, and maybe even the 3DS. They clarified that this would begin life as a fan game, possibly crowdfunded, with a release date set 1 year after the start of development, with all assets being released to fans. Although a once official developer, making fan games may seem weird, they have explained that the original Legacy of Goku began as an indie game with no funding, until the game was picked up officially near the end, and after it sold well, they got a contract to start on the second one. Perhaps they wanted to replicate something like that. They followed up in November with a much bigger post, which laid out everything. Fans would be able to vote on what Legacy of Goku 4 would become, whether it stay a 2D pixel art RPG, like the GBA games, use a new art style, or maybe even be fully 3D. Webfoot mentioned that they were experimenting with multiple directions, maybe rebuilding all 3 original games for modern hardware, combining them into one massive adventure, or finally moving past Boo's Fury. They even joked about VR support, but the post made one thing clear: nothing was in development yet. These were just mock-ups, and the team was testing the waters to see what fans wanted, and more importantly, if anyone would fund it. They encouraged people to submit fan art. These concepts showed game menus, 3D assets, visualizations for the 3DS and iOS, etc. And finally, they showcased a sprite of Goku, made by the original artist of the Legacy of Goku games. And that was it. Ever since this December 2016 post, there's been no word on the game. They've been inactive on all social media since 2021, so it looks like the plans just fell through. But there's a world out there where we got Legacy of Goku 4. This next game wasn't one that was cancelled, but one that was never actually meant to be released in the first place. At the 2008 Tokyo Game Show, held from October 9th to the 12th, Bandai Networks quietly showed off a strange little prototype called Dragon Ball Cross One Piece Super BT Battle, with the BT standing for Bluetooth. It was a mobile crossover between the 2 biggest Shonen Jump franchises, built to demonstrate a brand new feature that was kinda groundbreaking at the time: Bluetooth multiplayer. Instead of relying on the internet or cables, players could battle each other directly by connecting their phones nearby. The demo ran on KDDI's new KCP Plus phones, a slide-up phone that you could play as a controller, and it was quite polished. With a good set of One Piece characters, though only Goku was playable on the Dragon Ball side, and the game was officially listed as exhibition-only reference. It's kinda strange to make a crossover just to show off technology. Maybe something was meant to come out eventually, but it just never did. Though ever since then, we've gotten plenty of Dragon Ball and One Piece crossovers. Now, I don't really want to talk about games that came and went, things like Buchigiri Match. That game came out, lived its life, and then it ended. That's a video for another time, but I will make an exception for one game: Dragon Ball Online. Perhaps the biggest tragedy, and one of the most important games in Dragon Ball video game history. Honestly, neither Heroes nor Xenoverse would have existed if this game didn't sacrifice itself. Developed by NTL Inc. in collaboration with Bandai Namco and supervised by Akira Toriyama himself, this was a full-scale MMORPG set hundreds of years after the original manga, in Age 1000, about 216 years after the end of Z, and long after Goku and the other Z fighters have passed away. This game has a ton of interesting lore, like the destruction of New Namek, Goku and Vegeta leaving Earth for one final battle, Goten and Trunks starting a sword fighting school, and much more. But that's for its own video. They only had the license for the manga, so no original anime elements were used. For example, Toriyama had to make a new design for the Yardrat, a design which, ever since then, has been introduced into the Dragon Ball Super manga. Toriyama worked alongside Daiki Miki to create the designs for the game, with the most important being Mira and Towa, characters with a long legacy in games since then. The story focused on the villain Mira, who traveled through space and time causing chaos, teaming up with evil organizations like the Frieza Force and the Red Pants Army, forcing a new generation of fighters to protect the world. Players could choose between 3 races: humans, Namekians, and Majins, explore the Dragon World, fight enemies, and travel through time using time machine quests. This was also the introduction of Xeno Trunks, and the lore mentions a Supreme Kai of Time, though we never see her. All of this should sound familiar, since it became the primary inspiration for Dragon Ball Heroes and Dragon Ball Xenoverse. Dragon Ball Online launched in South Korea in 2010, then in Taiwan and Hong Kong the following following year. Sadly, despite its ambitions, it never expanded worldwide, and by late 2013, all servers shut down. The Korean version first on September 26, then the Taiwanese and Hong Kong version on October 31st. But there was a ton of material that never made it into the game, like Dragon World Challenge, an ambitious mode that would have supposedly let players face off against characters from the original manga. It was in the work for years but never reached completion. There was also an unreleased area called Fran Fran Desert South, likely meant for higher level players. There's also been discussion about flight combat, a feature players begged for, and according to reports, it did reach early planning stages, but was never implemented. And like any MMO that shuts down early, the game's files were scattered with unused cosmetic items, new gis, gear variations, etc, etc. One of the biggest features Dragon Ball Online never got was a new playable class for humans, the Engineers. Engineers were meant to be inventors who relied on gadgets and firearms, rather than ki or melee attacks inspired by Bulma. The class had been rumored to be in the game for years, but it never made it into any playable version, despite the existence of concept art. At higher levels, Engineers would have been able to specialize in one of two advanced paths: the Gun Maniac, who focused on weaponry, or a Mech Maniac. I'm sure you can figure out what that was. But honestly, my favorite unused content is Gevita and Hyororot, two random guys just cosplaying as Goku and Vegeta. I love them. Finally, I did want to mention games that teased sequels but never materialized. First, Attack of the Saiyans. This was an excellent RPG for the DS. It started at the very end of the 23rd World Tournament and took you all the way to the final battle against Vegeta, with plenty of original adventures in between, and even a secret boss against Broly. How exactly Saiyanar Goku defeats Broly, I'll never know. This game ended with a teaser for Frieza, but we never got anything else, and the developers moved on to create Xenoblade Chronicles. And though unrelated, as far as I know, there was once a phone game distributed through the iMode Dragon Ball mobile service, released in Japan for cell phones in 2008, which had a similar 3-character party system called Dragon Ball RPG. This was followed by an updated version in 2012 called Super Dragon Ball RPG. And then there was a prequel, Dragon Ball RPG The Boyhood Arc, released in 2013. Maybe I'll make a video about these obscure Dragon Ball games one day. Dragon Ball Z Burst Limit, a spiritual follow-ups to the Budokai games, released for the Xbox 360 and PS3, also had a teaser at further installments, as the ending shows Goku transforming into a Super Saiyan 2, something that never happens anywhere in the game, since it stops at the Cell fight. Another game that must have been considered at one point was Budokai 3 on the Gamecube, since Nintendo's console had both 1 and 2 released for it, but likely due to low sales, this port was never made. Making video games is hard, and making Dragon Ball video games may be even harder. Every single one of those games, from the 3DO Punchpad game to the Chinese MMO none of us got to play, was someone's passion. They were part of that same dream, to capture the feeling of charging up and shooting a Kamehameha. Some failed, some were forgotten, and some became the foundations of games we play now. But every time one of these projects disappeared, another one picked up the controller. Because as long as there's kids lifting up their arms to share energy with Goku, Dragon Ball games will never stop being made. Maybe that's what Goku would want, to keep on fighting, even if you never see the credits roll. Guys, you are not gonna believe this, but I just copped the 3DO punching Dragon Ball game. It cost me my whole life savings and probably my children's too, but I have it, so let's play it. Alright, let's give it a shot. Not again.